Hello, everyone, and welcome to the show. My name is Kamini, and this is episode 3 in the series Navigating King 5 AI Governance in South Africa. Let's start by quickly reviewing the previous episodes. In episode 1, we explored why King 5 matters for AI governance in South Africa. We grounded the conversation in Ubuntu, dignity, impact, and moral leadership. We spoke about AI not as a technical upgrade, but as a force that reshapes power, inclusion, and trust, particularly in a society with deep inequality and historical exclusion. In episode 2, we moved firmly into the boardroom. We examined where accountability sits under King 5, where AI systems influence decisions, risk exposure, and organizational outcomes. We were clear about one thing. While tasks can be delegated, accountability for outcomes cannot. Under King 5, responsibility for AI-enabled decisions ultimately rests with the board. So by the end of episode 2, we settled 2 questions. 1, what values should guide AI governance? And 2, who is accountable when AI systems shape outcomes? This episode addresses the remaining question that chairs and board members are now asking. So what do we actually put in place? And what does good AI governance look like in practice? This episode addresses the remaining question that chairs and board members are now asking. So what do we actually put in place? And what does good AI governance look like in practice? Because this is AI Ethics Navigator, I want to be explicit about how ethics shows up in this episode. In this series, Ubuntu is not treated as a moral aspiration or a cultural add-on. It is the ethical lens through which King 5 frames responsibility, dignity, and impact. And governance is the mechanism through which that ethical intent becomes real. In other words, ethical AI governance under King 5 is not achieved through value statements alone. It is achieved through ownership, controls, assurance, and accountability. Because this is AI Ethics Navigator, I want to be explicit about how ethics shows up in this episode. In this series, Ubuntu is not treated as a moral aspiration or a cultural add-on. It is the ethical lens through which King 5 frames responsibility, dignity, and impact. And governance is the mechanism through which that ethical intent becomes real. In other words, ethical AI governance under King 5 is not achieved through value statements alone. It is achieved through ownership, controls, assurance, and accountability that are shaped by Ubuntu's concern for human dignity, inclusion, and social impact. Across jurisdictions, across sectors, and across boardrooms globally, AI governance is now being tested not by what organizations say, but by what they can demonstrate. And King 5 reflects the shift very clearly. It moves governance from ethical intent to demonstrable governance, from aspiration to evidence, from value statements to mechanisms, controls, and assurance. And this is where many boards feel perhaps a bit uncertain. Not because they lack commitment, but because AI governance does not fit neatly into traditional governance categories. It is not purely an IT risk. It is not purely a risk issue. And it is certainly not something that can be outsourced to vendors or committees without authority. Globally, what I see consistently is that organizations do not fail at AI governance because they lack principles. They fail because they lack structure, visibility, and clarity of responsibility. So in this episode, I'm going to do three things. First, I will explain what changes in practice under King 5 when AI enters the picture. Second, I will walk through how boards that govern AI well actually do it, drawing on global best practice that has survived regulatory scrutiny, audits, and real-world incidents. And third, I will bring this back to South Africa, showing that King 5, grounded in Ubuntu and impact materiality, gives boards a coherent way to govern AI responsibly without turning governance into a technical exercise. The aim of this episode is to provide chairs, non-executive directors, or senior executives supporting the board a clear, pragmatic approach to answering the question, how does the board govern AI under King 5? Let's start by looking at what actually changes in the operating environment and why principles alone are no longer enough. So let's move into the practical shift boards are now facing. Boards that have strong ethical commitments have value statements, codes of conduct, and governance frameworks that speak to integrity and responsibility. What King 5 does and what AI makes unavoidable is change what good governance now looks like in practice. The critical shift is this. Under King 5, ethical intent is no longer sufficient. Ethics must be demonstrable. In other words, it is no longer enough for an organization to say, we use AI responsibly. Boards must now be able to explain how that responsibility is exercised, where it is embedded, and how it is tested. And this is where many organizations may experience discomfort because AI does not fit neatly into existing governance silos. Traditionally, boards are used to asking, is there a policy? Is there a committee? Is someone accountable? With AI, those questions are necessary, but they are not enough. And why is this so? It's because AI systems exercise delegated decision-making power. They influence who gets approved, flagged, excluded, prioritized, or denied, often at scale, often invisibly. That changes the governance question fundamentally. The question is no longer, do we have ethical intentions? The question becomes, do we have control, visibility, and assurance over decisions made in our name? King 5's emphasis on outcomes-based governance speaks directly to this. It asks boards to govern not just what they intend, but what actually happens. And that leads to a critical clarification around responsibility. Under King 5, the board is accountable for the organization's impact. Management is accountable for execution. Committees support oversight, but they do not absorb responsibility. And this distinction matters enormously for AI, because one of the most common governance failures I see globally is this: AI governance being treated as an operational or technical issue rather than a governance issue. When AI is framed as an IT asset, a data project, or a vendor solution, governance fragments. Responsibility becomes diffuse, assurance becomes shallow, and the board loses line of sight. Under King 5, that is not acceptable. AI governance must sit where power and accountability sit, and that is at the board level. This does not mean that boards need to understand algorithms. It means that boards must understand where AI is used, what decision it influences, what risk it introduces, and how these risks are governed. In practical terms, this is the moment where boards move from, we trust management to handle this, to show us how this is governed. That is the shift King 5 demands. And once the shift is made, the next question becomes unavoidable. If the board is accountable, what exactly must be put into place to govern AI properly? And that's where we now turn to how boards actually implement AI governance under King 5. So let's get practical. When boards ask me how AI governance is actually implemented, not in theory, but in organizations that withstand scrutiny, the answer is remarkably consistent across jurisdictions. Good AI governance is not a framework, it is a governance stack. A small number of components layered properly, each doing a specific job. I'll walk through these at board level, not as operational detail, but what boards must require. First, ownership and structure. Every organization that governs AI well starts here. There is formal board ownership of AI and data governance, not implied, not assumed, explicit. This means AI governance is recognized in the board charter and with oversight delegated via committee terms of reference. Oversight sits with a committee that already has authority, typically risk or a combined risk and technology committee. A named executive is accountable for implementation. All this matters because governance without ownership fails quietly. When AI governance sits everywhere, it sits nowhere. Secondly, visibility of AI systems. Boards cannot govern what they cannot see. In practice, this means that boards require living inventory of AI systems, automated decision-making tools, and third-party AI embedded in vendor products. The purpose of the inventory is not technical detail. It is to answer three governance questions. Where is AI used? What decisions does it influence? And what is the potential impact if it fails or discriminates? Globally, the single step surfaces more risk than most ethics workshops ever do. Third, decision rights and human oversight. Once visibility exists, boards must ensure clarity on decision boundaries. And it's not about micromanagement, it's about legitimacy. Boards should require management to define which decisions may be automated, which require human review, and which should never be delegated to machines. Escalation thresholds must be explicit, particularly where dignity, fairness, or exclusion is at stake. A simple test boards use effectively is this. Would this decision be acceptable if a human made it without explanation? If the answer is no, automation does not make it acceptable. Fourth, integration into enterprise risk. AI governance fails when it becomes a parallel universe. Globally, best practice is to embed AI risk into enterprise risk management, and this includes bias and discrimination, exclusion and access, opacity and explainability, and vendor dependency and model drift. If AI does not appear on the risk register, it is not governed, regardless of how sophisticated the models are. Fifth, assurance and evidence. This is the point where governance becomes real. Boards must require evidence that controls work. And that means internal audit testing AI-related controls, assurance that does not avoid opaque or vendor-owned systems, and for high-impact AI, independent review where appropriate. And in my opinion, in the spirit of King 5's evidential approach, ethics that cannot be audited is not governance. It's aspirational. Finally, response, and accountability. Even well-governed AI systems will cause harm. The governance question is not whether harm occurs, but how the organization responds. Boards must ensure clear incident response pathways, remediation and learning loops, accountability without scapegoating. This is where ethical leadership is demonstrated, not in prevention alone, but in response. This governance stack is not complex, but it is demanding. And once boards understand the structure, the conversation shifts from are we ethical to can we demonstrate governance? And in the next section, I want to show how Ubuntu fundamentally shapes how the stack is applied, not just why it matters. At this point, it's important to pause and address something distinctive about the South African context. Up to now, everything I've described could apply to boards globally, and in fact it does. But King 5 does something additional. It explicitly grounds governance in Ubuntu, in dignity, interconnectedness, and social impact. The mistake that many organizations make is treating Ubuntu as a value statement, something to reference in speeches or reports. But Ubuntu is not symbolic. Ubuntu appears in King 5's fundamental concepts through integrated thinking and embeddedness, informing how organizations should create value in their economic, social, and environmental context. It shapes the lens rather than creating specific operational requirements. And when applied properly, Ubuntu changes how boards interrogate AI governance. It does not replace controls, it sharpens them. Ubuntu asks boards to move beyond narrow questions of efficiency or optimization. It reframes the governance conversation from does the system work to who does the system work for and who does it fail. This is not abstract. Boards that operationalize Ubuntu use it to inform risk thresholds, escalation decisions, impact assessments, and assurance priority. In practice, Ubuntu translates into a small set of discipline questions that boards ask repeatedly. For example, who is excluded by the system, not unintentionally but structurally? Who bears harm if the system fails? Customers, employees, communities, or those with the least power? Whose dignity is affected by automated decisions? And how would we know this? These questions do not sit outside governance. They shape what gets measured, monitored, and escalated. And under King 5, impact materiality is not static. It is a living practice. AI systems evolve, data changes, context shifts. So boards must require periodic reassessment of AI impacts, feedback mechanisms that surface unintended consequences, and reporting that captures social and human impacts, not just performance metrics. And this is where Ubuntu becomes a governance advantage. It encourages boards to see risk early, before it escalates into regulatory failure or reputational harm. And why does this matter for AI governance? It matters because AI systems scale decisions. That means that they also scale exclusion, bias, and loss of dignity. And Ubuntu forces boards to confront this reality directly and to govern accordingly. And this does not make governance softer, it makes it more precise. Because when boards can articulate how dignity and inclusion are governed, they can also demonstrate leadership, not just compliance. In the next section, I want to situate this within global practice. and explain what South Africa should learn and what it should not simply import, and why, in the context of AI, Ubuntu functions not only as an ethical philosophy, but as a practical governance mechanism, shaping what boards measure, what they escalate, and what they refuse to optimize away. So let's now widen the lens. When we look globally at how AI governance is actually being implemented across Europe, the UK, parts of Asia, and in regulated sectors, a clear pattern has emerged. The global conversation has moved on. We are no longer debating whether AI should be governed ethically. The question is now settled. The focus is now on assurance. Across jurisdictions, regulators, investors, and boards are converging around the same expectations: visibility of AI systems, clear accountability, demonstrable control. This is why we are seeing a shift away from high level AI principles towards governance mechanisms that can be tested. In practice, this includes mandatory inventories of AI and automated decision systems, formal impact and risk assessments, integration of AI risk into enterprise risk management, and independent assurance for high impact systems. Why this is important to note is that these developments are not being driven by ideology, they are being driven by failure. High-profile AI incidents, regulatory enforcement, and litigation have made it clear that unmanaged AI risk is now a board-level exposure. Globally, effective AI governance has three defining characteristics. First, it is board-driven, where boards are passive, governance fragments. Two, it is evidence-based. Claims of responsibility are no longer accepted without proof. And thirdly, it is iterative. AI governance is treated as a continuous process, not a once-off compliance exercise. And these characteristics align closely with King Five's outcomes-based philosophy. At the same time, there are important lessons in what does not work. One of the most common failures internationally is the wholesale importation of frameworks without sufficient attention to context. AI governance does not operate in a vacuum. Social inequality, access to redress, digital literacy, and historical disadvantage all shape how AI impacts people. Frameworks designed for jurisdictions with different social and economic realities cannot simply be copied and pasted into South Africa. And this is where King 5 offers something distinctive. By explicitly grounding governance in ethical leadership, stakeholder inclusivity, and impact materiality, King 5 gives South African boards a coherent way to govern AI without separating ethics from execution. South Africa does not need to reinvent AI governance, but it must interpret it deliberately. Boards that do this well will not only meet global expectations, but they will demonstrate a form of governance that is credible, context aware, and exportable. In the final section, I want to bring us together by naming the common failures that board must avoid and the questions chairs should now be asking. Let me bring this together by being very direct. At this point, board should not be asking whether AI governance matters. The question has already been answered by King 5, by global regulators, and by experience. The only meaningful question now is, can this board demonstrate that it governs AI responsibly? And that depends not on intention, but on execution. So let's get down to what boards must put into place now. When I advise boards on this, I reduce it to a small number of non-negotiables. First, explicit board ownership. AI governance must be clearly recognized as a board responsibility. with defined oversight structures and named executive accountability. Secondly, visibility. Boards must know where AI and automate decision-making systems are used, including those that are embedded in vendor products, and understand their potential impact. Thirdly, clear decision boundaries. Boards must require clarity on what AI may decide, where human judgment is mandatory, and where escalation is required, particularly where dignity, fairness, or exclusion is at stake. Fourth, integration into enterprise risk. AI risk must appear on the risk register and be governed alongside other enterprises, not treated as a separate or future issue. Fifth, assurance and evidence. Boards must require internal audit and, where appropriate, independent assurance that AI-related controls work, including for opaque and third-party systems. And finally, response and accountability. Boards must ensure that there is a clear, humane, and credible response when AI causes harm, focusing on remediation and learning, not scapegoating. These are governance actions. They do not require boards to become technologists. They require boards to do what they already do, which is exercise stewardship over power and impact. Before closing, it's worth naming the failures I see repeatedly. Ethics policies with no ownership, AI registers that are produced once and never revisited, committees that advise but have no authority, assurance processes that avoid models and vendors, and treating AI as a futurist instead of a present power. These failures are not technical, they are governance failures. And in closing, King 5 does not ask boards to become experts in artificial intelligence. It asks them to remain what they already are: stewards of power, accountability, and human impact. AI governance is not new governance. It is governance finally being tested. And boards that meet this test will not only govern AI better, they will govern their organizations better, because ethical governance under King 5 is not a separate concern. It is the foundation of legitimacy, trust, and sustained performance.